Bienvenue, Chalasi. Welcome, everyone, to our January 22nd, 2026 Black and Indigenous Speaker Series event. My name is Jackie Gahagan. I'm the Associate Vice President of Research here at Mount St. Vincent University in Mi'kma'ki, and I'm really pleased that you're able to join us today. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that Mount St. Vincent University is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by treaties of peace and friendship first signed with the British Crown in 1725. And it's important to note that these treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact, it recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to become an ongoing relationship between nations. Mount St. Vincent University acknowledges with deep respect the long history of cultural traditions of the Mi'kmaq. MSVU is committed to maintaining and building relationships informed by the principles of trust, respect, reciprocity, and collaboration in the spirit of reconciliation. For me, this means seeking to understand and address the ways in which colonial structures and processes within research ecosystems have caused harm to Indigenous peoples, and to work towards addressing these in our own approaches to research. If you have the chance, please take a look at our MSVU Research Strategic Plan 2023-2028 for more information on the actions we're taking at MSVU to advance the conduct of research in a good way. I would also like to acknowledge that people of African descent have been in Nova Scotia for over 400 years, and we honor and offer gratitude to those ancestors of African descent who came before us to this land. For those of you who are new to our Black and Indigenous Speaker Series, again, welcome. Just to let you know, the purpose behind the Mount St. Vincent University Black and Indigenous Speaker Series is to highlight the work of both Black and Indigenous scholars from across Turtle Island. Through these presentations, our aim is to highlight Black and Indigenous scholars, to invite them to share their knowledges and worldviews, and to gain a better understanding of their contributions to their respective academic fields. And it's important to note that the Black and Indigenous Speaker Series strives to provide a safe and welcoming space for sharing ideas in a good way. And with the permission of our Black and Indigenous speakers, we record these talks and make them available for teaching and learning opportunities afterwards. Now, in terms of upcoming events, our next talk, beyond today's talk, is February the 24th from 12 until 1, where you'll hear from Dr. Rachel Zellers from St. Mary's University, who will be speaking on the topic of Black thriving in impossibility, which explores life beyond survival. Drawing on Black traditions of radical thinking, Dr. Zeller's talk will examine how Black communities practice imagination, refusal, and care within constraint. I hope you'll join us for that upcoming talk as well. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Debbie Martin from Dalhousie University, who is offering a talk on the trouble with Indigenous identity policies and how they're harming Indigenous peoples. Dr. Debbie Martin is a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples Health and Wellbeing, and is a Professor of Health Promotion at Dalhousie University. Debbie is the nominated Principal Investigator of the Wabanaki-Labrador Health Research Network. Thank you, Debbie, for being here. Our moderator today is Dr. Amy Hudson, who holds a PhD in interdisciplinary studies, specializing in Indigenous governance and community sustainability. Much of Amy's work is focused on advancing Aboriginal peoples' rights through Indigenous governance, land claim negotiations, and research. She's the owner of a consulting firm that supports communities, organizations, and governments in rethinking, reviewing, and developing effective governance practices and sustainable solutions grounded in inclusion, equity, and positive well-being. Now, following Dr. Martin's talk, we'll have a Q&A session in the remaining time today, and I would ask that you raise your electronic hand if you'd like to ask a question. And now I'd like to turn the virtual floor over to our moderator, Amy, for today's talk. Thank you again, Debbie and Amy, for being with us today. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you. And I think I'll just go straight into introducing Debbie. After Debbie's talk, we'll be happy to take questions, and I hope you enjoy this important conversation in the spirit of listening, learning, sharing, and growing together around topics that impact all of us in diverse and similar ways. So, thank you, Nakumik, Debbie.
Thank you, NunatuKavut, Jackie and Amy for the introduction and also for the opportunity to speak on this topic. So as you can see, my talk today is going to be talking about some of the academic university Indigenous identity policies and really how they are harming some Indigenous peoples by not giving due consideration to the geopolitical climate in which many Indigenous collectives are situated. You'll see here, before I get into my slides, I have a photo here of three distinct Indigenous collectives represented by their leadership. We have President Todd Russell from NunatuKavut Community Council. We have the Grand Chief Anastasia Kupi from the Innu Nation. And then on the far right, we have Johannes Lamp, who is currently the president of the NunatuKavut government. This is a photo that was taken back in 2017, I believe. It was a show of solidarity in response to protesting the development of the Muskrat Falls hydroelectric dam. And I just wanted to show that photo because I think it shows an example of Indigenous leadership working together to advance a common purpose. Before I move on, I have a couple of just sort of introductory slides. The first is around some of the terminology that I'm going to be using in case some of you are not familiar with the territory specifically in Labrador. So as Jackie mentioned, I'm a member of NunatuKavut. NunatuKavut is represented by the NunatuKavut Community Council. It represents Inuit and mixed Inuit ancestry in South and Central Labrador. We currently do not have a settled land claim. However, we have entered into a memorandum of understanding with the federal government as of 2017 to begin discussions around Indigenous rights and self-determination. And I should also mention that we do also have a treaty of peace and friendship that was signed with the British Crown back in 1765. NunatuKavut used to be called the Labrador Métis Nation, and that was formed back in 1980. It's important to note that even though the term Métis was used, it has always meant to represent those of Inuit and mixed Inuit ancestry in the territory described by NunatuKavut. The Innu Nation represents Innu of Labrador, mostly in two distinct communities, Sheshatshiu and Davis Inlet. They are recognized by the federal government as having Section 35 rights as of 2006. They also do not have a finalized land claim, although they do have a signed agreement in principle as of 2011. And then we have the NunatuKavut government, which represents Inuit of Northern Labrador. They are formerly known as the Labrador Inuit Association. Its land claim agreement came into effect in 2005. And NunatuKavut is represented nationally by Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, or what is also known as ITK. They're a national body that represents the rights and interests of the 4 settled Inuit land claim areas, of which NunatuKavut is one. And so a little bit more about me. I'm the mother of 2 lovely children. My son and daughter are pictured here. I completed an undergraduate degree at Memorial University. I also lead a network that Jackie mentioned called the Wabanaki-Labrador Indigenous Health Research Network. It provides capacity building and support for Indigenous communities throughout the Atlantic region. And so for those of you that don't know me, I have family ties to Southern Labrador that run quite deeply. My mom was raised in Fox Harbor, and my family lineage was used actually in NunatuKavut's original land claim as proof of Inuit presence in Southern Labrador. So I have the first photo you'll see there is a photo of my mom and her siblings. All of them were born and raised in Fox Harbor. I'm in the second photo, sitting on my grandfather's lap in the middle there. I'm very tiny, with my siblings, and those are my maternal grandparents. So those are the mom and dad of the 5 siblings that you'll see in that first picture. So their names are Paul and Violet Holly. They were also raised in Fox Harbor, Labrador. Both of them identify as Inuk. They did. They've passed on now. And so the family tree that you see here, it lists Ira Holly at the very, very bottom. And Ira is actually Paul, my grandfather's full brother. So you can see that 5 generations of my family, starting with my great uncle, begin here. And so including myself and my own children, that represents 7 generations that we can trace. And the reason that I wanted to point this out is because NunatuKavut has come under some significant fire and backlash with people suggesting that we don't hold Inuit ancestry at all, or that if we do, that we're reaching back into our very distant past to connect to it. What I demonstrate here is that there is actually no unbroken lineage. You can see here that as far back as we can trace, my family is made up of Inuit descendants and Inuit people. The only person that you can see here who's not Inuk is Anne Saunders, and she's actually Mi'kmaq from Newfoundland. So who are NunatuKavut Inuit? We are Inuit who are of mixed and Inuit descent, whose families are tied to South and Central Labrador. Our membership consists of approximately 6,000 members who have all been vetted through a comprehensive application process that requires a demonstrated connection to the territory as well as ancestral lineage that is verified by a professional genealogist. Inuit continuity and presence in Southern Labrador really predates the arrival of Europeans. This has been validated through not only historical records, but also our own oral histories, as well as archaeological evidence. As I mentioned earlier, in August of 1765 in Chateau Bay, which is just mere kilometers away from Fox Harbor, where my family is from, a treaty of peace and friendship was entered into with the British Crown. Our people really still maintain an active traditional lifestyle on the land, sea, and ice for those that live in that territory. We have had court decisions at every level of government that have indicated that we have the ability to assert Section 35 rights. In fact, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples affirmed that back in 1996 when it indicated that what we referred to as Métis at that time were a distinct Aboriginal people whose early ancestors were of mixed heritage, Inuit in the case of the Labrador Métis. Certainly, the Labrador Métis community exhibits the historical rootedness, social cohesiveness, and cultural self-consciousness that are essential to nationhood, and they are developing a political organization that will allow them to engage in effective nation-to-nation negotiation and to exercise self-government. And you can read the rest of that quote there as I take a sip of water. Okay. So our Inuit ancestors, like many Indigenous peoples across Canada, have faced really an onslaught of very horrific violence at the hands of colonizers for many centuries. And this has included horrible stories of murder, rape, and enslavement, as well as the erasure through efforts to remove us from the land. A historian by the name of Greg Mitchell and others have written about this violence in published peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Andrea Proctor really ties these types of very physical forms of colonization to more recent forms of colonization that I would say are more like conceptual in nature. So the logic of, she says, the logic of this settler colonial project, which is a sustained institutional tendency to eliminate the Indigenous population, informs a range of historical practices that might otherwise appear distinct. Settler colonialism works through this logic of elimination by attempting to erase the presence of Indigenous peoples through both physical or genocidal means and conceptual means. And so I think this is important as we move into the discussions about identity policies. And to highlight this a little further about NunatuKavut before we move on to those policies is to suggest that the narrative about Southern Labrador has been almost exclusively written from the perspective of people that are not us, often white settler men of European descent. For example, Hugh Palliser, who was at the time the governor of Newfoundland, described Inuit, or Eskimos, as he said, on the south coast of Labrador in this way. He said Eskimos had the character of being the most treacherous, barbarous of all savages ever known. Now, the next quote that I'm going to put up, I won't read it out loud. I will give you a trigger warning that it is about sexualized violence. 2 years previous, and I think it highlights the fact that, I don't think we were the ones that were the barbarous savages at the time, but Palliser's actually referencing British ships arriving in Southern Labrador. So all this to say that we continue to pursue our traditional way of life despite so many efforts to draw us away from it. And although we don't hold a settled land claim with the federal government, I'm hopeful that you will understand that this has more to do with how the process of colonization has unfolded in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, rather than the degree of indigeneity that we hold. Our people have been subjected to violence, forced removals through the residential school system, separation of children from their families, language loss, and a general lack of regard for the people of South and Central Labrador as human beings who deserve basic health, social, and justice services. And in spite of all this, there's a very active campaign by other Indigenous organizations to undermine our claims to Inuit identity. They are asserting that we are not Inuit at all, that we are in fact faking our identity to acquire resources and supports from the federal government. So what is the issue? The issue for me, and for really, I think, all members of NunatuKavut, is that in the rush to create Indigenous identity policies at academic institutions, we are being completely erased. As we move along in the presentation, I hope that it will become clearer to you and how and why this has been the case. I think, there's been an agreement in many cases that self-identification at academic institutions is no longer enough because it means that individuals can identify as Indigenous without any checks or balances. On one hand, universities, when they develop these policies, are receiving strong feedback warning against policies that are over-inclusive so that they allow too many people in, because then there's a risk that non-Indigenous individuals will continue to receive or begin to receive benefits and privileges that are meant to be designated for quote unquote legitimate Indigenous peoples. On the other hand, and I think, what my position is on all of this is that universities are also receiving strong feedback warning against verification policies that are under-inclusive, because what ends up happening is that they restrict the ability for legitimate Indigenous peoples to receive supports and services for which they are entitled. And this further discriminates already marginalized individuals who don't hold federal recognition or status. So I think, to ask why do we need Indigenous identity policies in the first place? And I think I explained that a little bit in the earlier slide, but I think the rubber really hit the road on this issue back in 2021 with the identification of a number of academics whose identities were found not to be Indigenous. And the photo I have here is of Carrie Barassa, which I think many of you might recall was one of the most preeminent, I think, Indigenous health scholars who was found by 4 of her colleagues, actually, her Indigenous colleagues, to not be able to validate or verify her own Indigenous identity. And, as someone who knew Carrie and was very, I was a colleague of Carrie's, it was quite a surprise to me to have this uncovered. In response, the University of Saskatchewan, which is where Carrie was located, produced a verification policy that was the first of its kind across Canada. The need for it was justified by the fact that many Indigenous peoples were saying that when non-Indigenous peoples fake an identity, it takes away opportunities, resources, and supports away from Indigenous peoples. And when people who are non-Indigenous take up these spaces, they often do so in ways that really reinforce stereotypes about what non-Indigenous peoples think that an Indigenous person should be and do and act like. So since then, I think within the Atlantic region in particular, there's been a number of individuals whose identities as Indigenous have not been able to be confirmed. For one, Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond was a faculty member in the Faculty of Law at Dalhousie. Vianne Timmons, who many of you know, was the former president of Memorial University. And most recently, Buffy St. Marie had an honorary degree revoked at Dalhousie University. So what do these identity policies say exactly? And I won't get into all of the details. Certainly, those are all available online for you to look at, but I will focus specifically on three and how they position the inclusion or exclusion of Inuit people. And in each case at Dalhousie Memorial and University of Saskatchewan, they really rely on who the ITK identifies as Indigenous. So those who have settled land claims in the 4 regions of Canada. And so this specifically excludes NunatuKavut from being included in the Indigenous identity policies under the Inuit heading. And that's the case for all 3. In the case of Memorial University, they have done something else in addition to that to say that a recognized Indigenous collective can either be a group that's federally recognized and hold constitutional rights under Section 35, or that they're accepted as an Indigenous collective by their federally recognized neighbors. And so this becomes problematic when we have Indigenous groups that don't agree with one another. And then they're asked whether or not they agree that another neighbor should be identified as Indigenous or not. And so this is quite a unique, I think, thing to Memorial that we haven't seen elsewhere that is quite problematic. In the case of Dalhousie, and I'll focus a little bit on this now, they created a policy that was really based pretty closely on an Indigenous admissions pathway that had already been implemented within the Faculty of Medicine for students that were applying to medical school. And so the Indigenous admissions pathway, the purpose of it was really to address false claims to indigeneity. And they wanted to ensure that people who were being accepted into medical school were able to produce, verifiable documentation that they were Indigenous. They go so far as to say that if someone is not able to produce that type of documentation, that their behavior is considered to be fraudulent, and they will be investigated and treated in accordance with university policy. I came to learn that there was an Indigenous person from NunatuKavut who submitted an application to the Indigenous admissions pathway, and that individual was not accepted because the documentation they provided was using their NunatuKavut card and subsequent documentation. I raised a concern to the Indigenous admissions pathway committee around this, and I received the following response. The Indigenous Admissions Subcommittee is aware of NunatuKavut Community Council and its assertion that it has the right to determine Inuit identity. The basis of this assertion is readily available in the public arena. The IAS is also aware that the NCC, NunatuKavut Community Council, has entered into a non-binding MOU with the federal government. However, it is important to note that this MOU neither specifies the nature of the rights held by NCC, nor does it delineate NCC's authority to identify beneficiaries of Section 35. In the absence of a definitive legal framework and amid clear objections from Inuit leadership with respect to NCC's assertions, the Indigenous Admissions Subcommittee is not able to use membership with NCC as an isolated means of verifying membership or citizenship. And so what this is suggesting is that NCC members need to be federally recognized, and should this happen in the future, that perhaps they would no longer be considered fraudulent. I think it's problematic to assume that someone who, is born an Indigenous person and, is able to, identify as such throughout their lives and then cannot prove it because they don't have federal recognition is problematic. And that not only that, but in not being able to prove it, that they're considered to be fraudulent. Memorial University at the moment is requesting feedback, or sorry, it had requested feedback on its draft Indigenous verification policy. This was after they had contracted a group called First Peoples Group, which is an Indigenous strategic planning firm, to do consultation sessions. They made a report public in May 2024. About a year later, MUN released its draft policy, and they requested feedback during a 1-month period. An access to information request was revealed that MUN received 119 letters of feedback about their policy. I sort of did a deep dive into what that feedback looked like. About 46% of the feedback received was actually very unsupportive of the policy as it was presented. Many of the people who were unsupportive of the policy were concerned about how NunatuKavut was being left out of the policy. A further 37% were supportive of the policy. And interestingly, many of these 37% were supportive of the policy because it excluded NunatuKavut from the policy. And then a further 10% were simply neutral. They offered feedback on the policy, but they didn't indicate whether or not they were supportive of it or not. And I should also point out that one of the submissions was made by the Inuk Nation. It was 197 pages long, and the entire document outlined why NunatuKavut Inuit should not be identified or included as an Indigenous collective under MUN's policy. And the reason that I wanted to highlight all of that detail is because I think that background really sets the stage for understanding something called the colonial politics of recognition. And Glenn Coulthard is the individual who wrote about this, and he acknowledges that settler colonial governments have imposed power over Indigenous collectives. They often position Indigenous peoples as inferior and that we are in need of oversight. But it goes further to say, and this is the part that I find really interesting, is that by positioning Indigenous governments as inferior and in need of oversight, it then creates a power imbalance amongst the Indigenous collectives themselves. And this becomes a real life, on the ground issue for Indigenous peoples because resources that are allocated from the federal government are often inadequate to meet the needs of most of the Indigenous peoples that are living in communities. This intentional underfunding has been demonstrated time and again through human rights tribunals and through third-party interveners like the United Nations. These external agencies have determined that federal government has a vested interest in watching Indigenous peoples fight with one another because it then absolves them of having to do anything about it. And it doesn't hold the federal government or any other settler colonial institution accountable. A key feature of colonial politics of recognition is that it fuels this division rather than resolving it. And I'm going to move on to an example of this. So again, back in 2021, which seemed to be sort of the, like I said, the year that the rubber hit the road in terms of Indigenous identity politics, especially in Labrador, a man by the name of Daryl LaRue, who's a faculty member, or was a faculty member at St. Mary's University at the time, conducted a non-peer-reviewed report of NunatuKavut's land claim. This was commissioned by the NunatuKavut government. In his report, he concluded that NunatuKavut's claim to Inuit territory was not supported by any evidence and that our claim as a distinct Indigenous people was baseless. Approximately a week after LaRue released that report, Nathan Obed, who is the president of ITK, which represents Inuit groups nationally, used LaRue's research in a letter that was sent to the Prime Minister at the time, Justin Trudeau, calling on the federal government to exclude NunatuKavut from accessing any Inuit-specific funding or initiatives because evidence suggests that NunatuKavut territory has never been permanently occupied. I wrote a rebuttal to LaRue in which I sort of picked apart the report that he wrote, and I identified that in that report he had falsified data from Statistics Canada. he had misinterpreted conclusions of other researchers. He had omitted significant bodies of research that disagreed with his own assertions. And since then, I recently read another paper that's the fourth one that's listed here, that was submitted by the Innu Nation to the Tri-Agency as they were developing their policy on Indigenous citizenship and membership. And in it, they assert that the rebuttal that I wrote is actually evidence that NunatuKavut Inuit are weaponizing ethical research principles instead of protecting legitimate Indigenous peoples. And so I think I would like to suggest that this very I don't know if the term is violent, but very angering set of circumstances over the past number of years really validates why it is not sufficient to use existing federally recognized groups to validate who is Indigenous and who isn't. And so I decided to write a paper that was published just before Christmas in Policy Options that talks about the fact that universities are really rushing to develop these Indigenous identity policies and the problems and the harms that this is causing to Indigenous peoples who are falling outside of those policies. And part of the issue for me is that we really don't have a way to distinguish between someone who is and someone who isn't Indigenous. There's not really a good way to do that unless we are using federal recognition, which is a colonial tool. And I think this is a really critical point, because if we run the risk of alienating and criminalizing Indigenous peoples who have very valid and legitimate identities simply because the federal government has failed to address their land claim titles in a timely manner, that they shouldn't be penalized for that. And so the question is whether or not we're actually rooting out fraudulent behavior, and perhaps we are in some instances, or are we simply causing harm to Indigenous peoples whose identities don't fit neatly into a box that's been created by the federal government? So I think there's really two extremes that seem to be happening. At one side of it, you have really concerted efforts to have, in this case, NunatuKavut excluded from university policymaking. The problem for me with this approach is that it really assumes that Indigenous organizations, other Indigenous organizations, can be impartial adjudicators of the Indigenous identity of other Indigenous organizations. And if an Indigenous individual doesn't fit neatly into a box, they're simply considered collateral damage. And what I mean by that is the fact that both NunatuKavut government and the Innu Nation have said and written that they believe that some individuals within NunatuKavut do hold Indigenous identity, but that on the whole, the organization itself is not Indigenous. And so what that tells me is that for those of us who are Indigenous, we don't matter. That we can be excluded because they don't like the way that NunatuKavut has created its own inclusion criteria. And to me, that is not for an external Indigenous organization to decide. It should be an Indigenous self-determination of who's included and who's not. And then at the other extreme, you have human rights and legal analyses of various institutional policies. There was one completed by Naomi Metallic and Cheryl Simon of Dalhousie's policy that really looked at the ways in which the policy was considered really too blunt an instrument to deal with such a nuanced issue as Indigenous identity. So if this is the case, then what can we do? Do we just keep allowing pretendians into academia? And I would argue that the origins of the issue are really not Indigenous. They are the result of settler colonial issues. It should not be left to Indigenous peoples to figure out a mess that's been made, and we shouldn't be the ones to bear the brunt of policy making that is actually harming Indigenous peoples, and is actually the fault of non-Indigenous peoples that are posing to be Indigenous. So how are NunatuKavut, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples being harmed? One of the things that I think is happening is that there are material harms, which I'll talk about here, but then there's also emotional harms, which I'll talk about on the next slide. In terms of material harms, faculty, staff, and students, I think, are all being affected by this. We see restrictions on the ability to apply for funding. We see issues with being able to teach courses that have Indigenous content. We see a reluctance to participate and an inability to participate in administrative contributions around Indigenous issues. We see restrictions on recruitment of new Indigenous faculty and staff because in some cases people are reluctant to apply for these positions if they know they're going to undergo these rigorous verification tests to be considered. And overall, this has limitations on university-wide Indigenous initiatives. Students become ineligible for Indigenous specific awards and resources and other types of admission processes. And again, they're also being limited in terms of their contributions to Indigenous initiatives on campus. I should also say that because of these harms and the very real implications that this has had on NunatuKavut Inuit, we released a survey just about a year ago that asked NunatuKavut Inuit how and whether or not they are being harmed by some of the violent behavior that's being experienced by saying that they're not Indigenous. And the results of that, we're just in the process of sharing it back to the community. So I can't really speak to the specifics, but I can say that we did receive quite a significant response rate to that survey, and that many of the individuals that responded are feeling very, well, I'll kind of get into it a little bit, but very exhausted and insecure about their own identities as they try to pursue post-secondary, as well as some of the harms that are coming from the bullying, et cetera, that is being enabled by university policies that extends outside of the university. And so some of these emotional harms mean that individuals are feeling very excluded, that they are feeling erased, which I think harkens back to that slides that I was talking about earlier around, you know, the history of Indigenous peoples being erased. They feel unsafe when attending Indigenous specific events. There's a lot of emotional turmoil, exhaustion from constantly having to defend yourself. A lot of people are expressed feeling unworthy of receiving Indigenous specific awards or opportunities, and then they're choosing not to apply for certain opportunities. Then beyond the university, and anybody who's seen the social media ads advertising this event can speak to the fact that it has really enabled bullying and abuse towards NunatuKavut Inuit. It's created tensions amongst family and friends. Policies are being based on the politics of issues rather than the evidence that exists. In some cases, the scholarship that exists even within those specific academic institutions, and that this has increased bullying in schools and workplaces and other public places. And so I am going to end there, but I don't want to end on a very super negative note. I do want to say that, and go back to that amazing picture from 2017, to suggest that Inuit identity is really about kinship and spirit. It doesn't necessarily translate well into university policies or any type of settler colonial logic or box. It is incredibly relational, and it can't be limited by checkboxes or petty politics or land titles. For me, I think what is a big red flag in this entire process is really institutional overreach, and that we're not really looking to the stories of individuals who are attempting to make their way in spaces that are settler colonial societies. And I think we really need to ensure that we're making safe spaces so that we can work together as distinct Indigenous peoples, and I hope we can get back to that, to try to work together to address these issues that are fundamentally not Indigenous issues, they're colonial issues. NunatuKavut, thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for your presentation and discussion of, some incredibly relevant and significant issues that that are currently happening across the country and indeed in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador and within the Atlantic region. As I listen to the conversation that you are engaging us in, I recognize that many of these topics and issues can be explored and understood through engaged research and community, learning from communities, but also through anti-colonial and decolonizing scholarship as a way to understand how the perpetuation of colonialism continues to impact Indigenous communities and peoples across what is now known as Canada. Very important discussions for our future citizens and future generations of our country, no doubt. With that, though, we have about, mental math is not my thing, 7-8 minutes left. For questions. So please, feel free to raise your hand. And Bernadette has raised a hand.
Hi. First of all, Debbie, thank you so much for this presentation. Let me lower my hand. I am a faculty here at MSVU. I am of mixed Ganeega-Haga ancestry from south of the border. What is now called New York, and the layers of complications of ancestry there are insane. I mean, the way records were kept in the US were very different than the way they're kept up here. My father was illegitimate. Go prove my back. How do I prove? And he was born in 1923. There wasn't all this stuff. And when I was first hired here, the level of scrutiny wasn't there yet. And I was interviewed and I was asked by the Indigenous advisor at the time. And I told him my story completely and totally and my background, and I was hired. And the first year I was here, I was interrogated in front of a full meeting of the Faculty Association about my Indigenous identity and ripped apart. And all the things you said about feeling excluded, feeling intimidated about being in these spaces. I've been at conferences for ILSA, the Indigenous Literary Studies Association, where Leanne Bettasamsamage Simpson got up and started off talking about pretend Indians. And then I spoke to her and she was surprised because she usually doesn't speak to people who are on the other side of the coin who are, you're not Indigenous enough. This idea of not being indigenous enough is completely, as you well said, a settler colonial construct. And at the same time, it is totally reasonable that Indigenous people would want to protect the limited resources that we have from exploitation by people who are just seeking to wear a mask of indigeneity. So my question to you is, do you have any suggestions or advice for people like me? I live my life. I'm 64. I've always been Indigenous to the best of my knowledge. I what do I do? And what do I do? I mean, how do we work through this? Do you have suggestions? And I really, first of all, I really want to say thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Bernadette, and I appreciate you being so honest and genuine about your own identity and struggles. And I think if I had the answer to that, I don't, maybe I wouldn't be here. But I think one of the things that I just can't do is not be unapologetically who I am. And I think that creates space for other people to be able to hopefully do the same thing. And for me, if I'm a faculty member, I'm tenured, I have security, etc. And if I can't speak out about what I see as injustice happening, then I don't know who can. So that's kind of the way that I look at it, because I know that I'm not alone. I know that these experiences are happening to other people, and they're often happening to youth, right? Youth who are also struggling with their identity just by nature of the fact that they're young people, and that's what they do, right? They come into their own usually in their 20s when they are starting to go to university and so on. And so the exploration of who you are happens at that age, and to now suggest that they have to fit into a certain type of box, it is really, I think, detrimental to Indigenous peoples generally, and can be very harmful. So like I don't have great advice on what to do other than to be proud of who you are, and to just keep I guess keep in mind that when you speak up, and each time that you do, there may be somebody else who is benefiting from your voice, who also doesn't feel like they can.
I really appreciate you, and like I say, I know that there's not going to be any answers we can, come to here, but just hearing that I'm not tenured yet. I'm on the tenure track, and I even had a conversation with the president about this. I'm not fraudulent. I came here. I told you my story. You hired me. I am who I am, and it's challenging, but there are people who reach out, and I am very grateful to people like you. So thank you very much for your time.
I appreciate that.
Sego. Niahwe, rather. Sorry. I'm learning my language. Bye.
Okay, thank you, Bernadette. I'm just checking for more questions. I think, oh, okay, we see a question. John?
Hey, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks, Debbie, for that presentation. It's very insightful and very meaningful. As the Vice Provost, Indigenous Relations at DAL, of course, just to clarify that we are in the process of looking at and understanding what the policy development process is for Dalhousie University. And it's an ongoing conversation, of course, we'll always have. There's no definite, I think, policy that will always, or at any time, represent any nationhood or any cultural ethnicity, or even I argue about the same conversation when we have about gender and sexuality, because it's always based on like a static understanding of what identity is, when in fact we're always in flux. And I understand that about NCC, and we understand that about a lot of our Indigenous communities, and the ongoing discussion with that. So it's very important that we have all insights and perspectives on that. Do you mind sharing what NCC does in validating its own identity, so that people would understand how that could be shared with other perspectives, so that one could understand, the processes by, and this is what we try to do. We try to engage with Ulnu, Wolastoqey, Wabanaki, and understand what, that validation or verification of citizenship or membership may look like. And also, I think by understanding that, we also would understand some of because we're talking the same language. At the end of the day, membership to NCC and validation is the same thing. How we approach it may be different, and that's important that we understand those approaches and that are more meaningful and respectful to cultural identity and perspectives in that sense.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. Thanks, John. I appreciate that. Yeah. So, and Amy, feel free to jump in here if there's anything that I am not saying here. But when you apply to be a member of NunatuKavut, you're given an application form, and that application form asks you to complete your ancestry back. I think it's 3 generations back. 3, is it? I don't know.
There's I guess Debbie, if you don't, I can I
You
help
can, yeah. Why don't you do
yeah,
it?
I help
You know more about the identity.
I help
membership
create the
policy.
citizenship code, and so at foremost it relies on verified ancestry. So of course NCC is cognizant of oral histories, but there must be verified records. So even in case there are people within the territory that I know of that are excluded and don't hold membership because there's no verifiable record, church records burning, things like that. I should note that NCC and NunatuKavut government use the same genealogist, Dr. Patty Way, because of all the family lines. So ancestry is one, the first key factor. Then there is there's a cutoff for community connection. So if you have yourself, in my case, myself, my parent, and my grandparents all live in the region. But if it's a great grandparent, and say if Debbie was living in Newfoundland and it's her great grandparent that came from the territory, she would not be eligible. So there's a generational cutoff for Inuit ancestral people. And then there's commitment and connection and kinship expressed within the territory and throughout kinship relationships as well. Debbie, I don't know if you can.
Yeah, no,
those are the key.
Yeah, those are the big ones. Yeah, and I think it's important to point out too that the ancestral connections are quite overlap between NunatuKavut and NunatuKavut, and most of, sometimes there's siblings that are a member of one organization and others are a member of another, just based on where they live, not necessarily their ancestral lineage. So.
No, and that's a great point. I mean, those are all important aspects because they overrelate to a lot of the ongoing discussions around membership and citizenship for a lot of the organizations and or nations, right? And or organizations that coincide with the existence of nationhood with organizations. So there's, an overlapping interest in understanding what that looks like. So that's important. And just for clarification, when you do apply for any pathways, with, in this case, the medical pathways at Dalhousie, and when you go down to a designated process, I will clarify that you're not put into a fraudulent category when you don't fit that process. That is a miscommunication, I believe, or a misunderstanding of that. But there's no intention for DAL to identify people with fraudulent behavior, unless it was something that was intentional. And that most people that apply for different things believe who they are, and we try to believe that. And so we want to give benefit of the doubt. And so part of the policy development here is to understand what does that look like and how does that represent the person individually and collectively. And there's all kinds of conversations that Debbie positively pointed out that's important to make sure that we get it right. And so we have to have those conversations, ongoing conversations at that, because we have to leave room for any policy development process to have a margin of error and to make it better. The idea is to make it better so that it's more inclusive rather than what Debbie had mentioned, be harmful. And that's important as well as a consideration in developing that process. So I just wanted to clarify that part. And thanks for the information, Debbie, and for the talk as well. I hope we can circle back around and have a conversation more through a cafe style, you and I, about some of the concerns I have with that and some of the stuff that I'd like to consult with you on developing our policy. So
that
thanks.
Sounds great. Thank you, John, for
Thanks,
that. That was a really important question. Glad you asked that. And one more quick question. I think I see Jacqueline with a hand.
It's not a quick question. It's just we're at the end of time, and I just wanted to before we sign off to say a sincere thank you to Debbie Martin. This is a really, really important conversation to have, and we're so grateful that you took the time to actually engage us in this important issue. And I understand that this requires ongoing conversations and an openness to looking at how to reduce harms going forward. So I appreciate this is a very nuanced, complex issue, and a big gratitude to you for that. And I also just wanted to remind folks that, and thank you, Amy, for being our illustrious moderator. It's a pleasure to have you here as well. So thank you. Just a reminder that our next talk is coming up on February the 24th, and this is with Rachel Zellers from St. Mary's University, who'll be talking about Black thriving in impossibility. I hope you'll be able to join us. Again, thanks everybody. Take care. Bye for now.
Thank you, Jackie.